And there's
There's
Trolley
Trolley.
up on the top.
Moustafa Bayoumi, 2008 American Book Award winner, profiles 7 Arab Americans living in Brooklyn and talks about their experiences following 9/11. The event, hosted by Politics and Prose Bookstore in Washington, D.C., is 50 minutes.
I'm very happy to welcome Moustafa Bayoumi to the Politics and Prose tonight. He, as I think some of you know, is Associate Professor of English at Brooklyn College. He's written this book to remind us about one more troublesome aspect of the United States' war on Islamic terrorism. What does it mean to be a Muslim youth today in the United States? And he expresses it in W.E.B. Du Bois' classic expression in the title of his book, How Does It Feel to Be a Problem? Obviously, and Moustafa will, of course, tell us about it, not good. So the book is written for 2 audiences, as I see it. First, it brings out into the open the experience that many young people are having today. The book will let them know that they are one among many. Second, it behooves the rest of us to find a way to let American Muslims know that they are part of the fabric of America like the rest of us. And this is something perhaps we can talk about in the question period. How can we help? So it's really nice to have you with us, Moustafa Bayoumi.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carla, and good evening to you all. And it's a real pleasure to be here at Politics and Prose to introduce my book to you, which has been out just over a week. Yeah, yes. So I'm delighted to see. I'm sure everybody here has read it though through, right? So, but as Carla was saying, the book is entitled "How Does It Feel to Be a Problem?" And one could answer that simply, I guess, with, well, it sucks. But that would be a very short book. So I decided to look at it a little more deeply than that. And I began, I began by thinking about that title, with Du Bois obviously echoing in my brain, The Souls of Black Folk echoing there. And if you know anything about The Souls of Black Folk, I'm sure many of you have read it, a classic work in American letters from 1903, written really during the height of Jim Crow, during official segregation, during a time in American history when two different populations, African Americans and the wider American society, were really legally separated from each other and didn't have any contact, really substantial human contact with each other, right? So Du Bois ends up writing this book, this very eloquent, beautiful book, The Souls of Black Folk, as he says, to lift the veil, he says, between populations, right? To show, in a sense, the wider experience of in a wider lens, what the African-American experience is to the general American public. And it seemed to me somehow 100 years later, 104, 105 years later, that it was appropriate to take another look at that book by Du Bois and rethink that book in a sense, or at least some of the framing questions of that book as it applies to Arab and Muslim Americans today in the wake of the war on terrorism. Now, in no way, I just do want to make it clear, though, in no way am I saying that, what's happened since September 11, as terrible as it has been in many instances, but not all, as you'll see if you read my book, does that equate to a history of what African Americans have gone through in the United States. I'm not trying to appropriate another history here, obviously. Slavery and segregation and trench discrimination, that's all a deep part of American history that has to be recognized. But I am thinking, I think, in terms of how racial difference works, how racial formation works in the United States. And so I wanted to think about the Du Bois question, framing it when it comes to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. And then there was another reason also for choosing the Du Bois, which was in Brooklyn, where my book is set. There's a lot of affinity, really, between young African Americans and young Arab Americans. between Black and Latino culture and Arab American culture, increasingly, especially at the younger level. So it also felt natural, felt correct in a sense to draw those connections in the title, at least. So let me tell you a little bit about my book, though. It is a book. Fundamentally, it's a book of stories. It's about 7 different young people, all between the ages of 18 and 30, all who have lived in Brooklyn or live in Brooklyn. So their stories are based in Brooklyn. Some of them have since I finished the book, have moved out of Brooklyn, but most of them actually still live there in Brooklyn. There's in my book, there's 3 women and 4 men, and all of them are Arab Americans. 6 out of the 7 are Muslim Arab Americans. Of course, most Arab Americans in the United States are Christian, and I talk about that as well in the beginning of the book. Thank you. But I decided to concentrate my book on Muslim Arab Americans, since they're really the ones that are in the eye of the storm, as you could say, today, right? The one story that I do have of a Christian Arab American is about Sami, who's a Marine who fought 2 tours in Iraq. And even his story has repercussions for what it means to be a Muslim Arab American, insofar as he's connecting with assumptions that people have of him as being Muslim, even though he's Christian because he's Arab, or the assumptions that his fellow Arab Muslim friends will have of him since he fought in the war. I'll get to that in a second. Okay. Thank you. So, what I thought I would do today is tell you a little bit about each of the stories to hopefully tantalize you a little bit, and also tell you about why I chose Brooklyn as a location for my book. And it seemed to me that what I really wanted to get at in this book also was the complications of lived experience. I don't really come to this book with a lot of ideology or, an agenda, as it were. I was looking for how people actually live their lives. I wasn't really looking for stories that were about heroes or villains exclusively, people who have only suffered or people who are only triumphant, but really about all the different kinds of shades of gray in life. And it seemed to me much more important than to think about lived experience, about the concreteness of life. So in order to do that, I thought it's much better for me to locate my book in a specific setting, and that setting is Brooklyn. For one thing, it's because, of course, I live in Brooklyn, so I didn't have to travel for the book. But also because Brooklyn, I think, means a lot to me. It also, of course, is in the proximity of the World Trade Center and Ground Zero, as they call it today. In New York itself is a very vibrant, alive place. So let me read you a little bit about why I chose Brooklyn, which is from the introduction of my book. Brooklyn, incidentally, too, in the 2000 census, the U.S. Census Bureau, for the first time, enumerated Arab Americans, right? And so they said that the largest Arab American community, according to the U.S. Census, was in New York City. And the largest by gross numbers, not by density. Obviously, Dearborn, Michigan is much more populated in density. But in gross numbers, New York City has the largest number. And Brooklyn has the largest number within New York City, right? So that was another reason why to choose Brooklyn. Yet far more important than base numbers, I write, is the borough itself. Brooklyn is chiefly no whole or recognizable animal, writes James Agee, but an exorbitant pulsing mass of scarcely discernible cellular jellies and tissue. With more than 2.5 million residents, it is the 3rd largest metropolitan area in the country. Size alone does not account for its energy. Robber barons, refugees, free blacks, and the international working class have all settled here, whether in leafy Victorian mansions or in limestone, brownstone, or federal-style row houses, making the story of Brooklyn a short history of human escape and reinvention flattened through geography and narrated through architecture. Walt Whitman once called it the city of homes and churches, and yet it is more. A country on its own, Brooklyn continuously repopulates itself, first by boat and ferry, and now by the plane loads of the world's exiles and emigres, and it brims with all the rhythms and pageantry of 21st century American life. Today, Brooklyn is Prospect Heights with its late-night barbershops, all fabulous hair and atomic light at 12 a.m. Or Coney Island, a seasonal experiment in radical democracy, held in a riot of colors and soundtrack to amusement park songs. It's the Friday afternoon call to prayer in Bedford-Stuyvesant. Brooklyn is a tourist-free Chinatown in Sunset Park, or the dollar stores of Flatbush Avenue that spill their wares onto the noisy street and away from their weeping, scarred, and aching buildings. It's dreadlocked West Indians flying kites in Prospect Park, or the colony of middle American defectors in Williamsburg, urban hipsters costumed in androgynous jeans and monotonous tattoos. It's the bourgeoisie of Brooklyn Heights, living in stately grace, but with barely suppressed feelings of self-loathing for not owning a 212 area code. Brooklyn is the slowly dissolving Italian hub of Bensonhurst, the Syrian Jews of Ocean Parkway, and the Pakistanis of Coney Island Avenue. It is the birds of Greenwood Cemetery singing their songs to the Civil War dead. Upper crust Haitians living well in Midwood Estates, and intrepid diners visiting Bay Ridge's transplanted Mediterranean coast, where high on the old Nordic 3rd Avenue, sea air mingles with the garlic aromas floating out of the Arab, Greek, and Italian eateries that line the street. Brooklyn is the informal urban apartheid of Eastern Parkway, the soft socialism of Park Slope, the Russian capitalism of Brighton Beach. It's the salt marshes of Marine Park, the roast beef sandwiches on Nostrand Avenue, DeFerris Pizza, Vox Pop, and Vinegar Hill. Brooklyn is the dangerous rush of traffic on Atlantic Avenue, where bus exhaust mixes with the smells of fresh bread and Arabic spices. It's the madness of Pacific Street, where parents seek refuge from the urban cacophony in its tiny community garden. And Dean Street, where the Chinese food is halal. It's true. I didn't make that. Nothing's made up. Brooklyn, I write, is the concentrated, unedited 21st century answer to who we, as Americans, are as a people. So after setting my book in Brooklyn, I decided, let me look in, well, it's not, the chronology is a little off. I wrote that after I'd found the stories. But I have 7 stories in the book. So let me tell you very briefly what the stories are about. The first story, Rasha, is about a woman who was detained with her whole family about 6 months after 9/11 in one of these mass arrests that happened after 9/11. I'm not sure if you're aware, but people estimate, the law professor David Cole estimates at least 5,000 people were basically arrested without just cause after 9/11. And in fact, the Office of Inspector General of the Attorney General's office issued a report saying basically the same thing, essentially the same thing. So her family is one story, and her in particular is one story about that detention. And the reason why they were detained is they were a Syrian family who had lived in the United States for 18 years. She was 19 years when she was picked up. She'd lived in the United States about 15 years of those 16 years. But in that time, within that long period of time, even though she was in the United States, their papers were not entirely in order. They had applied for asylum status, but they hadn't adjusted their status. And if anybody knows anything about immigration law in the United States, it can be an excruciatingly long procedure to get your papers correct. That made them vulnerable to the authorities right after September 11, along with their Syrian birthplace. So that's the first story. The second story is the one I mentioned earlier briefly, Sammy, who's the Arab American who decides one day that he's not going anywhere in school. He doesn't know what he wants to do. He's bored out of his mind. He's going to join the Marines. He gets a call from a recruiter. Some of his friends had joined the Marines. He decides to join the Marines. It's early 2001. So he does basic training, and then on September, he has a little bit of a break, and on the night of September 10th, he boards a bus in New York City to go to his Marine combat training. And then, of course, it's an overnight bus. The next day, they find out what happened, and everything changes. They know that they're going to go to war. He had joined the military for entirely other reasons, and now he fights 2 tours in Iraq during this time. And actually, something interesting happens to Sammy, as I tell it in the story, in the book, is that he is not that Arab identified in his life in the U.S., but as he goes to Iraq and he fights, he becomes more interested in his Arab identity. And so you get some sense of that in the chapter. And then he comes back and he starts to associate with some Arab Americans who are in the college where he goes, and they don't want to have that much to do with him because he fought in Iraq. So it's this complicated story of allegiances and affiliations. The third story is a story about a young woman, Yasmin, who in high school, she's very ambitious, and she decided that she was going to run for student government. She succeeded as a freshman, and she actually won a position of secretary. And yet there was something that stood in her way, because one of the duties that she hadn't been told about beforehand was that all student officers had to attend all school events, and that included school dances. Now, she's a religious woman. She covers her hair. And she said that she doesn't think she can go to the school dances. The school essentially forced her to resign her position. So she then fights with all the muster and energy that a 15-year-old or 16-year-old can to overturn the school's decision. And I'm not going to tell you how it turns out. Okay. So then the fourth story is Akram. Each chapter is named just simply for the person whose story it is. And Akram is a young Palestinian American who works in his father's grocery store. His father came from the West Bank in the early 70s with nothing, and is, through almost a quintessentially American dream type story, labored his way through working in other people's grocery stores. If you know anything about Brooklyn, you know that the grocery store is a central location for Arab American life. A lot of the small corner grocery stores are run by Arab Americans. So his father is one of these stories, and he's able to essentially he buys a store, and he provides for his family through the store, and the kids work. He has two boys who work in the store. They work there all the time, 90 hours a week during the summer, 65 hours a week during the school year, constantly working. It takes a real commitment to run those stores. And after September 11, things get more difficult for Akram because of all the pressure that's coming at him from different parts of the culture, and he wants to succeed, and he wants to do something more than just work in the store. So it's kind of a story about class. At the same time, it's about politics and geography. He and his friends are very interested, actually, in Dubai. And Dubai, for them, is opportunity. And so it's almost this re-scripting of the American dream. His father came with the quintessential American dream and saw the United States as the land of opportunity. And many in Akram's generation have an Arab American dream of relocating to the Gulf, where there's a lot of new money and flash going on. And then another story is Lena, who is an Iraqi American, and she has a very complicated story that involves all these different loves of her life and conservative parents that she's constantly battling. At the same time that the two men in her life end up coming from one, they're both Iraqi, one is from a dissident family, and the other one, as it turns out, ends up being arrested as a spy for Saddam Hussein. I'm not kidding. He was eventually deported to Jordan. So her story is a very complicated story about how, being Iraqi, you can never really escape from politics. Then the fifth story is about Omar, who worked as an intern. He worked in Al Jazeera, and he got an internship there. And he wanted to do media. He was a communications major in school. He was very, very excited about this internship. He felt it gave him all kinds of street cred amongst his Arab American friends that he's working in Al Jazeera. And he thought that this would be his launching pad to a career in the media. And so he started, after the internship was finished, he started handing out resumes and trying to get a job, and he couldn't get a job. Nobody was calling him back. So he was convinced that maybe the Al Jazeera, which he thought was going to be his ticket out, was actually blacklisting him from his work. And so I explore employment discrimination in that chapter, not just his perceived employment discrimination, but there are actually several studies that have come out now in the last recent period that talk about employment discrimination against Arabs and Muslims. And the last chapter is Rami. Rami is a young Palestinian American whose father was also picked up by the authorities. They had placed an informant in the grocery store where he was working, and in that store they were doing some illicit cigarette smuggling. You know, one of the things that the government did after 9/11 was they went after all the grocery stores, what they called small scams. They looked for small scams because they were really targeting the community in all kinds of ways. So the father got caught up in all of these immigration procedures. Rami was a high school football star in his high school and devoted all of his time to football. After his father gets picked up, Rami starts to become more religious, which is quite common among a lot of the Arab American youth that I was spending time with, that they became more religious actually after September 11. And he then decides that Islam is his new devotion, no longer football. And his father in prison, who was never really particularly religious either, becomes more religious in prison. And so the two, the father and the son, start to get to know each other in a whole other way as they become independently more religious. So his story is also, there are layers to it. But each story I'm trying to tell richly and thickly, to tell it like a human story, not just a newspaper article. No offense to journalists in the audience. I'm just going to read, very briefly, I'll read a little bit from Yasmin's story to give you a sense of that. And then we'll move to question and answer. So Yasmin was trying, as I described her story earlier, was trying very much to overturn the school's decision, and she was hitting all kinds of brick walls. No one was listening to her, and she did all this legal research on her own, she went to the public library, she took out this book, Sue the Bastards, Law for Dummies, all these different things. She was trying to learn exactly what to do. Finally, a local lawyer, a Muslim lawyer, said that maybe he was interested in her case, and he said, come and meet me. So she comes with her father to meet this lawyer. That's where I'm going to pick up the story. It was an early evening meeting, and Yasmin and her father took the subway to Midtown Manhattan after school. They exited the elevator and found the offices empty except for the attorney, who invited them in. Yasmin was impressed by the stately, reserved elegance of the place. A Muslim lawyer, she thought. That's awesome. He sat them down in a boardroom with a big oak table and asked Yasmin to explain the story. She immediately launched in by describing the Equal Access Act and the basics of contract law. Just explain the story to me, he said patiently. So she did. She took out her smiley face folder and detailed how she had won the election, been forced to resign, lost her right to run again, and everything else that had happened. He took notes on a yellow legal pad as she spoke, interspersed with nodding his head or humming assent. Yasmin finished, and then he spoke, first offering the now 17-year-old some advice. Whenever anyone said something related to the case, he told her, she should note what was said, the speaker, and the date. Yasmin listened with open ears and canyon-wide eyes. That will be your evidence, he said, and Yasmin nodded. So what should we do, she asked, almost holding her breath. He thought they had a case, he said, and she began breathing again. He couldn't promise they would win, he said, but there was a case to be made here, one that the courts would decide. And then he started talking about money. He told Yasmin and her father that a lower court decision would require a $6,000 retainer. If it moved to a higher court, fees might reach $10,000 to $12,000. And he kept walking up the litigation ladder with higher fees and higher courts while Yasmin nodded and her father said nothing. The meeting ended. Think about it, he said, as he showed them out. You know how to contact me. For the first time, the thought hit Yasmin. Wait, is my dad going to pay for this? He'd said it was worth it, she'd surmised, so he'd probably pay. Outside, Yasmin was bubbling with excitement over the meeting. She turned to her father. What do you think, Baba? They were walking to the subway, descending the stairs. It's a good case, Habibti, her father said. But I have 4 daughters. I have to put you all through college. I can't pay $12,000 to $20,000 to bring a case to court that might lose. They waited on the platform, and suddenly Yasmin felt her imminent victory sliding away. But Baba, she pleaded, it's for a good cause. It's for all the Muslims. If it becomes a good law, then it applies everywhere. She had learned this from her legal research. The subway roared in, all rattling noise and clanging steel. Think of the money, Yasmin. It wouldn't be fair to your sisters. They have to go to school too. He paused, and the conductor announced, Stand clear of the closing doors, please. We'll think about it, he said, which in Egyptian parent speak, as Yasmin well knew, really means no. In February, just briefly, Yasmin took the lawyer's advice to heart. She was sitting in leadership class when the coordinator of student affairs explained that he was the one who basically had forced her to resign. He's a faculty member. Explained that since Greek Easter begins on a Friday, Greek students, and there were a lot of Greek students in the school, Greek students in leadership would be excused from a bodybuilding event to be held on a weekend in May. In addition to dances, Yasmin didn't attend the school's bodybuilding contests, which she described in an email as, quote, a show of half-naked contestants flexing their muscles, which I feel is inappropriate. She scribbled a note on a piece of paper, beginning with the date and the time of the coordinator of student affairs' comment. 2402, 12:41 p.m. Greeks, Good Friday Greaster, will be excused for religious obligations. And then she quoted the coordinator on student affairs. For religious obligations, I'm willing to make exceptions once in a while. She recalled when the e-board changed the date of a dance so it wouldn't conflict with one girl's private party and wrote underneath, Sweet 16, not a religious holiday, duh. Make one exception, 5 follow. Later, she found out that the executive board had put her on a maybe list to get kicked out of leadership. Thank you.
Questions? The microphone is right here in the center, please. I forgot to mention that we are lucky enough to have C-SPAN here and Book TV, and so this event will be televised. Tune in to your look on the internet for the schedule, and you'll find out when it's coming up, probably maybe as soon as the weekend after next. So we need to have all the questions at the microphone.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, thank you. With these people in these 7 cases,
Yeah.
did you have any trouble gaining their confidence?
For some people, it took a little longer than others, but no trouble, really. It just took some time. The way that I found the people, this interests some people, is when I first had the idea for the book, I went to some of the community associations, I talked to community lawyers, I went to the mosques, I talked to imams. That helped to some degree, but mostly I talked to my friends and they talked to their friends, and so on, as the old shampoo commercial says it, right? So sociologists will call that a snowball sample. They do. That's the official term, a snowball sample. But I wasn't really interested in sociology. I was really interested in just finding the best stories that I could tell. So I was interested in finding people who had full stories that had a narrative arc to them. And that's what I wanted to get at. So once I started telling people that I was writing this book, people started giving me all of their different experiences. And a lot of those were very interesting, but they were more the sort of minor indignities, small things that had happened to them here or there. And I put a few of them in the book, but I was really interested in the people who had the best story to tell from a narrative point of view. I also saw this as a kind of writerly project, to sort of think about how I can write about these people's lives. And so that's why I wanted to get those kinds of stories as well.
Do you mind a methodological question?
Please.
How did you decide that your chapter was going to be only on 7? Did you start with a larger sample in mind and then sort of narrow it down? Did you cast the net wide? And you did allude to that in answer to the previous question.
Yeah.
But if you could just, let us know the highlights of methodologically, because obviously the end result is something that is well integrated, well put together.
Right. Thank you.
But going through that is in itself a story like the other stories.
Sure. Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you. Well, I probably talked to, I don't know how many, but certainly dozens and dozens of people in the course of writing this book. And I had some vague idea about a couple of chapters that I thought I was interested in finding a soldier story, because I thought a soldier story would be inherently interesting. So that one I had already kind of in my mind. And I thought with the war in Iraq that an Iraqi-American story would be inherently interesting. So I did go, you could say, searching for those 2 stories out of all of the different stories that came to me. But even they didn't turn out to be what I expected. Most of my friends come from academia or, a different background, different class background, different political background often, or than many of the people that I talk to. And the Iraqi friends that I have, many of them felt that the invasion of Iraq, they felt really torn at the time of the war for the invasion of Iraq in the beginning, because they wanted Saddam Hussein to be gone. And then as the occupation soured and things got worse and worse, then their opinion of the invasion and of the war also soured. So I expected a kind of narrative of disillusionment for the Iraqi-American story. I certainly didn't expect to find a woman who'd had, a relationship with a man who was arrested, turning out to be a spy for Saddam Hussein. Who could expect something like that? So a lot of the stories turned out to be quite surprising to me. And then once I started hearing the different kinds of stories, and I've been around the community for a while as well, so I know what some of the major issues already are. I know that a lot of the young men, especially, are very concerned about getting jobs, and so employment discrimination can be a big worry on their consciousness. And so I would talk to Omar, and I thought, well, here's a perfect example of that. I didn't really think, okay, I want an employment discrimination story, but they matched up well. Like, I had that sense somewhere, and his story came, and it reminded me of that. And so they all kind of fell into place. So it was a little bit of both, And then I did have I had an eighth story, which was with a policeman, because there's also a fair number of police officers who are Arab American in Brooklyn. And I thought that might be interesting too. And he was one who had a beat around the Arab American community. And so we started talking, and methodologically, it takes time to do any of these stories, because you spend a lot of time with these people. People ask me about this book as a book of interviews. And yes, it is a book of interviews, but I think of it as more than that, because I spent time with each of the people to try to really get to know them, not just for them to tell me about their lives, but also to experience as much as I could their lives. So, and that I gained a lot of their trust by just hanging out with them. So I did that with the police officer for a while, and then he got cold feet, or he just stopped returning my calls, and I'm not still to this day sure why. He also got promoted, and he got moved to a different section in the police department, so that might have been the reason, but I don't know.
Thank you for your talk. I noticed that you focus a lot on youth. Most of the people that you interview, men and women, are younger.
Yeah.
I was wondering, first of all, why you chose that, and also if you could talk about family life, for example, parent-child relations and sibling relations, and grandparents' relations with them, and if you think that any of this changed post 9/11.
Okay. Yes, youth is definitely also a character in the book, I think. I think of it as a character, the same way that I think Brooklyn is the setting and youth is a character. And the reason why I wanted to look at youth for this book was, multiple. For one thing, it seems to me that that the young people have all kinds of expectations that are put on them. That they are trying to forge a better future. They're forging ahead. They have a lot of expectations that they put on themselves and that their families have for them to succeed and to gain respect for themselves and their families and their communities. The communities put some pressure on them to, put the good name of the community out there in an era where it's increasingly difficult, et cetera, et cetera. So they have that burden on them. At the same time, that young people, young Arabs and Muslims are also, I think, especially the men, are the ones that are most feared by the general culture. So they live somewhere in between these two expectations, and they make fun of them, of the association with terrorism all the time. They use humor as a way of defeating it, right? And so it seemed to me very important to think about youth for its kind of contradictions and its complexity. And the other thing is that it's a young community in general, and there was another point, but I've forgotten it. So I'm no longer young. I lose my train of thought. Also, for me, it was just a lot of fun to hang out with young people too. But so that's one thing. In the book, I would say that when it comes to family life, I think the book is not. One of the arguments in the book, I suppose, is perhaps the most banal and uninteresting argument that any writer can bring, which is, well, actually, there's a lot of diversity. There's a lot of range. So I wanted to show, because it's true. I was really interested in trying to access how people live their lives. Some families are much more conservative, some are less conservative, some are more religious, some are less religious, some families are more extended, some are less extended. So I think it's hard to say what family life in general is like. You could make some generalities that family life is very important, that people tend to live with their families probably longer than they do in sort of general American society when you move out, when you go to college or these sorts of things. But that has something to do also with the class background of the people I was talking to, because they're mostly working class from Brooklyn. So I think that there was a kind of, there's a lot of range in that. And I try to get at some of the conflicts, the family conflicts in the book too. One of the things that struck me was that it seemed like a lot of the people from the parents' generation, oh yes, now I remember what the other point was. It was this, that in, that 2001 now, September 11, was now almost 7 years to the day, right? So for me, I'm X number of years old, so I have some memory of what it was like, of course, before. I know what it is. As an adult, I had an identity, an already formed identity, about what it meant to be me, what it meant to be Arab, Muslim, all of these things prior to September 11. And then September 11 happened, and then you can use that as a way of understanding your world. But for many of these people that I was talking to in my book, September 11 is their whole adult reality. And so that too, I think, is very foundational, is very important to underline.
I think that it would have been nicer if Yasmin had been willing to participate in the school's social activities, but as herself and as her own identity. I happened to hear parts of your interview with Public Radio this morning, and the theme of your presentation was a bit stricter than as you've spoken this evening. And the problem is essentially one of the themes that you discussed was a Syrian girl who was imprisoned for several months. So my question really is twofold in that, and that is what happened to have the family imprisoned for long periods of time, and if someone gets it wrong, how to get it right. And then the second part is much more serious, and that is it's been forgotten that an idiot came very close to killing Ronald Reagan because he was in love with Jodie Foster, the actress. Right. And the huge problem has been the suicide killer. Today on CNN, there was a repeated discussion of a 15-year-old girl who may well have been duped into being the bomber. So the problem really is how the communities are able to trap the killers, the persons who really create havoc for all of us.
And where was that suicide bomber?
A girl was trapped in Baghdad.
In Baghdad, in a war zone.
Well, one actually in Baghdad and all parts of the country can be considered at risk to harm.
Right. Yeah, sure. Those are very serious questions. And first, let me see if I can go through them one by one.
Why Jasmine didn't want to participate in the social activities, but as herself.
Yeah, she actually offered a compromise to the school, which was that she would stay for twice as long as the dances required, but she just would not be in the place where the dances happened. So she would stay in a different part, and so she was trying to work out some kind of compromise that would illustrate that she still had enough school spirit to be working for the school.
She's away from the dance. She's not at the activity.
Well, I mean, you can read the chapter and come to your own conclusions. Whether religious accommodation is a legitimate, value to be had, so that you can accommodate students as long as they can still fulfill their functions.
It's like hiring a typist who can't type.
Some people felt that way. She certainly didn't.
Well, but the second more important part was if somebody gets it wrong or government gets it wrong, what needs to be done in your mind to get it right?
Well, I think we have to be vigilant about protecting the rights of everybody, frankly. I think that the only way to protect my rights or your rights is to protect everybody's rights. So you cannot scapegoat or let it be easily made a legal truth that a whole community should be made into a suspicious character, which I think is basically what had happened, in part because of the exigencies of law enforcement, but also in large part because there was political gain to be had by it at the time. So it makes the government look like they're doing something, if they arrest 5,000 people, even if they're totally spurious arrests or basically fundamentally spurious, if the people are arrested essentially because of their birthplace, which is what happened. So it seems to me that it has actually very little to do with Arabness or Muslimness, and it has everything to do with the valued principles of fairness and equality that are essential to running an open and free and democratic society.
And the last one was how to deal with the suicide killer and how the community can stop it as best as possible.
Look, I think that suicide bombing is an immoral atrocity that happens in our world. And I think that there has to be a way to try to minimize the levels for political violence around the world. Anytime you have any civilian who's killed in a conflict, in a war zone, or in any kind of conflict, that's a tragedy, and it's not fair. And it has to be. We have to do what we can to get rid of these kinds of problems in our world, obviously. But I think to think that suicide bombing is somehow related only to the Muslim community, I think is too easy an equation to make. And in fact, if you look at the social science studies in this phenomenon, apart from the media discourse around it, you'll see that in fact suicide bombing has occurred and does occur in many different communities, and is very much related to the facts of military occupation of one's homeland, whether that be in Sri Lanka or in Iraq, in Lebanon, or in various other parts of the world. So I think that sometimes we need to have a greater political clarity than a kind of media knowledge that is given to us every day.
Thank you. Thank you for your description of Brooklyn, among other things.
Oh, sure.
As someone who lived in most of those parts of Brooklyn, it's a wonderful thing. I'm curious, and particularly thank you for your very serious answer to the last question, which is unfortunately an all too common accusation that somehow the Arab and Arab American communities in this country are somehow responsible for suicide bombings that happen in Iraq or in Sri Lanka or somewhere else. My question has to do with the diversity, sorry. Because in my experience in Brooklyn, the Arab communities and Arab American communities were very, very different. The Yemenis were very different from the Egyptians, who were extraordinarily different from the Palestinians, who were not quite as much, but somewhat different than the Lebanese, who were way different than either the Syrians or the Moroccans. So it was...
Don't get me started on the Algerians.
We won't even go there. But, and I always thought, well, I'm a Jew, so what do I know, But the reality was all my Arab friends said the same thing. So I'm just curious, how you dealt with the national identity question as well as youth,
right,
et cetera. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. But it's unfortunately it's a little bit too easy to answer because I was really dealing mostly with second generation kids, or what sociologists might call 1.5 or even 1.75 generation. They use these terms, I'm afraid. But so second generation is somebody who's born here. Parents are the immigrants, right, and the child is born here. He or she is the second generation. 1.5 would be someone who's come with their family at a young age. 1.75 is an even younger age, right? So that most of their conscious life is here. So most of the kids that I was hanging out with were second generation 1.75, 1.5. And so they really they associate very easily with each other, even though they recognize and they make fun of their differences all the time. There are a lot of Palestinians in Bay Ridge where a lot of this is happening. And so, once I started hanging out with them, then it was all Egyptian jokes, because my family's Egyptian, so, but I can take it. So there's a lot of banter back and forth between the different groups, but there's no acrimony, and there certainly is at some level there is you could say some kind of differences in the tempos of life. And so they would make comments on this too. For example, Akram, I don't know if I put this in the book, I don't think so, but I remember Akram, once we were driving back from his store, and we passed the Yemeni store, and he described to me how the Yemeni stores are open 24 hours. You can always tell if the store is Yemeni or Palestinian, because the Yemeni stores are open 24 hours a day, and the Palestinians close at 9. Right? And the Yemeni stores, they tend to have everybody in the family work, and they have large families, and people will go back for years at a time, back to Yemen. and then come back. So they have these large families that can rotate people like that. This is somewhat different for the Palestinians. So there are these kinds of rhythms of life differences. But on the political level, I found that at that second generation point, there wasn't that much. There was a consciousness of difference, but it didn't manifest itself in any real way. And it's true also for, they also hung out very much with Arab Christian, at the same time with non-Arab Muslim. And so there wasn't really these sort of strict, I just hang out with this group kind of thing. And so you can see some of that in the book. I do detail a little bit of that in the book.
Okay, this will be our last question, last but not least.
Thank you very much for a very fascinating presentation. I'm really delighted that you're shedding light on new eras in the US, but I have no idea what's going on. But learning from you that there's a large youth group, there's these youth face problem with unemployment and they're struggling. These are the same thing that we have seen in Paris, we see it in Copenhagen, and it actually explodes. If you pair this information with the fact that you mentioned to us that 5,000 people have been rounded up, why is this not explosive? Why is this youth not rallying up and doing what we have seen in Paris and in Copenhagen and elsewhere? Thank you.
Thank you. That's an excellent question, to think about the comparisons, in other geographies as well. And I appreciate the framing of the question, because I think that one of the most important things when you're talking about these kinds of issues today is to really, I think, place the communities inside of their own national contexts, rather than talking about them as a kind of global or international phenomenon where everybody has the same mindset. Because the national realities really dictate the differences, I think. And so it has a lot to do with how American society is run, how French society is run, how British society is run. Those things are very important. They have a lot of impact on these. So I think that there are many, many different reasons too, and I can detail a few, because I also think that you can't have, I'm afraid, you can't have an easy answer. There's not just one answer, but there are several layers to it, I think. The first is that is a question of class and integration, right? In Europe, basically, the Muslim populations who have come from different parts of the Muslim world, who are working in these parts of Europe, they were brought in as a laboring class, and they were never really integrated they were never really wanted for anything else but their labor, right? Whereas the United States is a little bit different, because the United States is essentially, at its heart, it's a colonial settler society. It wants people to come here, right? And it has a different kind of ethos about people coming here. This immigration history, its immigration mythology is very different. And that actually does play a big role. That's one. I think another thing is there's a very different relationship of religion in the United States with, say, France, right? If you think about France as an example, in France, in the United States, you have the separation between church and state, as you do in France, right? But in the United States, you are separating the church and state because you're protecting the church. You're protecting the church from the state, right? That's the religious persecution, fleeing, coming to the United States. You're protecting the church from the state in the United States. That's why that separation exists. In France, it's the other way around. Protecting the state from the church. That's why you had a revolution. So you need to think about, how these different things play out. Thirdly, you could also talk about the fact that I think that there are many different histories of political violence that people can latch onto in Europe that they can't latch onto for whatever reasons in the United States. So that are very recent and proximate, right? So in England, you have the IRA. In Spain, you have Basque, the ETA, right? In France, you have the Corsicans. You have this kind of stuff happens routinely. Whereas in the United States, it's not part of our political memory. It's not part of our political vocabulary. Maybe that's a good thing, but it's not, right? I remember I watched that documentary. I'm sure it's a good thing, but I watched that documentary on the Weather Underground a few years back. I don't know if any of you saw that. Just a fabulous documentary. And they're going through, and there's this one segment in it where it's like, there was this bombing and that bombing and this bombing and that bombing in the early 70s. And your jaw just kind of it drops, and you say, well, I did. It's like, really? This happened? It's not part of our vocabulary. Whereas in the United Kingdom or other places, it's been present for a very long time, that's a terrible immoral, horrific way of political speech. So I think that there are many different layers that are attached to it, alienation and exclusion. The United States has a different philosophy towards those things. And so on the one level, I think in the domestic sphere, those are the major differences. And on the other level, so it's become very complicated to, I think, exist in the Western context as a Muslim, say. Because in the United States, too, but at the same time that you have this relatively open and relatively accepting society here, although I think there are problems, and I detail them in my book, but my book is actually quite optimistic about the United States as a whole, internally, domestically. But then you have the United States as this foreign power, with this really terrible foreign policy, as far as I'm concerned. And so what's different, I think, about the Arab American and the Muslim American situation, maybe it's not that different, but it's somewhat different than a lot of other ethnic groups, or at least in the American imagination, is that the history of a lot of other ethnic groups in the United States is about domestic policy. Their exclusion is because of certain things in domestic policy that they face. Whereas the fate of the Arab and the Muslim communities in the United States is basically hinged on American foreign policy. And so that also plays out, I think, in the quandary.
Words about the Japanese, because that's what we think of when we think about.
And I think it's very appropriate. I mean, obviously, what happened to the Japanese also was on another degree of horror compared to what happened for the 5,000 people or more who were detained post 9/11. There's no comparison, but there is some similarity. One can draw intellectual similarities between them, I think, and one should. I think that there's a great deal to be gained by looking at these sort of comparative ethnic groups and trying to understand how American society as a whole deals with these questions. And what I say in my book is that the Arabs and the Muslims are now they're the newest minorities in the American imagination. Right? Because it seems to me that what's really important also to think about is that this is all a post-civil rights phenomenon. And we'd somehow, maybe it's not very naive on my part, but at least be very conscious about racial formation and racism and these sorts of things. And the speed by which it could happen again seems a little troubling to me.
It's a great way to close a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely fabulous.
Thank you.